Few people survived Ted Bundy to share their encounters firsthand. Bundy's horrifying crimes belied his charming demeanor. It was easy for him to gain the trust of strangers. Those who remember the infamous man recall his likability and attractiveness, qualities that stuck in their minds even years after he passed. Author Anne Rule wrote a book, The Stranger Beside Me, detailing her close friendship with Bundy. She never suspected him to be a monster. Some Bundy survivors, like Ronda Shipley, shared their harrowing experiences. Other people reportedly met Bundy on a whim. Their respective tales, however, are wholly haunting. In 1974, a young man in a Volkswagen approached Ronda Shipley and offered her a lift. She recalled the experience. He looked like a college student, and he presented himself as a college student. And then he turned away. That didn't seem like the normal route to go to the university. And I asked him about that, and he said, "I hope you don't mind, but I have a little errand to run up by the zoo." And so then we went up the canyon. The canyon where the zoo is, it's up next to where the university is. So it wasn't really way out of his way. It still wasn't alarming or anything. It was fine to me that we took a little detour. It wasn't very far out of our way, and I'm thinking, I'd still be home faster than if I'd took the bus. We got to the zoo and he kept on driving. I said, "I thought you were going to take me to the zoo." Kind of joking with him. And he said, "No," I said, "near the zoo." He continued to drive up one canyon and then into another, never stopping. And that's when the ride started to feel uncomfortable. He stopped talking to me. All this time we'd been talking about school and campus, new buildings, road construction, the stuff that people who don't know each other well talk about, light chatter. And then he starts slowing down as we go around corners. He's looking at side roads, turnoffs. He pulls in finally to a picnic area that's kind of deserted. He pulls back into the trees a little way and stops the car and turns it off. And then he turned in his seat so he was almost facing me and leaned in really close. I thought he was going to kiss me. But instead he said, "You know what? I'm going to kill you." And he put his hands on my throat and started squeezing and shaking me. The last time I regained consciousness, the passenger door was open and the dome light was on. So I could see him. That was the only light in the whole canyon. I could see him standing over there, facing away from me, doing something in the back seat of the car. I just jumped and ran in the other direction into pitch blackness. I just took a couple of steps because my pants had been pulled down around my ankles. So I tripped and tumbled, but I fell into a mountain river that wasn't really deep, but it was really, really swift. There were boulders and bushes and tree limbs sticking out. The water swept me away from him, and it's probably what saved my life. I was 17 and living in Seattle in 1974. And my boyfriend and I went to Lake Sammamish on one of the first beautiful days of the season. I was sunbathing on a towel near the building that housed the restrooms. My boyfriend, not a fan of just laying in the sun, was 50 yards away or so, leaning on his parked car, chatting up some other guys. I noticed a man kept walking by me to use the drinking fountain. Each time he passed, he would stare a bit. I thought he was attractive enough, but in a real dweeb kind of way. Finally, he approached me and we started a conversation. He asked me if I wanted to go out in his canoe. I said no, since I was here with my boyfriend. He then asked if I would help him launch it into the water, that it was tucked behind some trees across the parking lot. I said that I was completely not strong enough to help him with a canoe, but that my boyfriend could surely lend a hand. I got up and started walking toward where my boyfriend was leaning against the car. Bundy followed me. At just about the same time that he said, "No, no, no, you can do it," I called out to my BF and said, "Hey, this guy wants some help with his canoe." My BF immediately felt the chill, and he told Bundy, in the rudest way I had ever heard him speak to anyone, which he has said had to do with his primal revulsion to the guy, to get the hell away from her and from us. Bundy said, directly to me, and this is the iciest piece that stays with me most, "This is your lucky day." Of course, I didn't understand that for a long time. That day he slayed 2 women that he picked up at the lake. 2. Both resembled me in stature, the way they wore their hair, etc. In a 2018 interview with Cairo TV, Suria Kritsonis recalled an incident from 1972 when she was 22 years old. She claimed Ted Bundy pulled up to her in his VW to offer her a ride. He goes, "I've come down Rainier Avenue, and that's a long way and there's no bus in sight. Would you like a ride?" I got into his car and he just started yelling at me, "Why did you take this ride? Why did you even think about taking this ride? You're never going to make it to school. You're not making it. I told you that before." Then he goes, "Take your hat off." And I said, "What do you mean, take my hat off? What for?" I took my hat off and he saw that something was different about me. He goes, "Why did you cut your hair?" Back in 1969, my uncle attended the University of Washington with Ted Bundy. They were both psychology majors and had developed a friendship. My uncle Danny said that Ted seemed to be a relatively normal guy at the time. He used to be quite the ladies' man, apparently. He told me how Bundy had an interest in binding women, particularly during sex. In fact, Bundy spoke with Danny about sex on many occasions. He used to tell him the types of horrific things he'd do to women. According to Bundy, the women were always consenting. He used to tell me about a little girl named Anne who had beautiful blue eyes and stunning blonde hair. He told me they were friends and she looked up to him. He claimed one day she vanished and he was devastated. "Of course, now that I think about it, Ted probably killed her," he said, trying to hide his tears. Uncle Danny's stories got more vivid, especially pertaining to Ted's sex life. But Ted felt it was never good enough. He asked me once, "Have you ever thought about being intimate with a corpse?" But I laughed. I thought he was joking. And he also told me how once him and Ted went to a party together. Ted ended up taking a girl home. When Danny asked how the date went, Ted didn't say anything. Instead, he stared at my uncle blankly. The next day, my uncle and Ted were driving around in his infamous Beetle. My uncle noticed how Ted's door handle was broken. He offered to fix it, but Ted declined. My uncle also smelled an awful stench coming from the car. When he asked Ted about the smell, he simply said that he'd ran over a raccoon and it got stuck in the frame of his car. He'd also remembered Bundy looking at several different women on college campus. Bundy definitely had a type and Uncle Danny caught up quickly. He preferred slim brunettes. In fact, he had set up Bundy with a fellow classmate. Later on, he found out from the girl that Bundy was a total freak. According to her, he came on a little too strong and she ran off. She never gave the details of exactly what happened between her and Bundy. After Bundy graduated, he and my uncle still kept in touch. They'd write to one another. Ted would send very detailed letters to my uncle. Most were about how upset he was with women and his family. He was very bitter. It was my first semester back to BYU. It was a cloudy and rainy day and I was walking to my 9 a.m. sewing class. As I approached the Wilkinson Center under the covering on the patio, I saw a handsome gentleman in a nice suit. His eyes were glued to me as he watched me approach. I remember how it flattered me. As I got closer, he said, "Hi, do you go to school here?" I told him yes. "I've seen such good people here," he said. "I'm from out of town and I need to go to downtown Provo to speak," he said, eyeing my umbrella. "Could you walk me to my car so I don't get my suit stained in this rain?" he asked. Here was my chance to be a good example of what a member of the LDS church should be. I wanted to be of service to him. I told him, "Yes, I have a few minutes before my class begins." I had a beige 3/4 length raincoat with a wraparound belt and a pink umbrella to cover us both on our trip to his car. We walked through 3 different sections of the parking lot, each taking us farther away from the Wilkinson Center and from my class, so I asked, "Where's your car?" He said that it was just a little bit further. We walked a few more steps when all of a sudden I felt him grab the belt on the back of my coat. I thought, There's no reason he needs to be doing that. I turned around and jerked hard and got away from him. I ran back quite a ways, and then I turned and looked at him. I thought I had made a mistake and had overreacted, shattering my image of a nice BYU student. He said, "Why did you run away? I wasn't going to hurt you. Come back and get your umbrella." I said, "No thank you, you can keep it." And I kept running. I told a friend about it, and she asked if I had reported the incident to security. I told her that I didn't and admitted to her that I probably had just made a fool of myself. I remember that he was very nice and extremely handsome. I was very flattered that he would want me to help him to his car. I kept thinking and dwelling on the fact that I probably had overreacted and left this out-of-towner with a poor image of the church and its university. I thought of this strange occurrence several times over the years. In January of 1989, after I had moved to Arizona, I watched a Ted Bundy show starring Mark Harmon. It was the night before Ted Bundy was executed. As I watched the movie, I thought it was strange that it said that he was in Provo and had killed a girl there. I thought of my experience with the handsome man in the nice suit. As I watched the rest of the movie, they showed a picture of Ted Bundy. I looked at that face and saw those eyes, and I knew it was him who I ran away from at BYU. I was numb and felt like I had melted away right there into my gray carpet. I started crying, and as I cried, I kept saying over and over, "That was him! That was him!" As they showed all the pictures of the girls he slayed, I looked just like them, tall, thin, long hair parted in the middle. I couldn't sleep that night. When I woke up to my radio alarm, the first thing I heard was that Ted Bundy had just been executed. It was January 24th, 1989. When I look back on all that happened that day, I ask myself, if he was legitimately needing refuge from the storm, why didn't he buy his own umbrella? All I could think of at the time in my youth and inexperience was that I had embarrassed myself and the church by not being more accommodating to him. Those were my thoughts then. I so easily could have been one of Ted Bundy's statistics. An old boss went to the University of Utah and was in a sorority. One day she was waiting for her date in front of her sorority house with a girlfriend who was also waiting for her date. Her girlfriend's date pulls up, but her girlfriend forgets something and runs back in the house. My former boss chatted to the man for a few minutes. She noted that he was polite and handsome. Her girlfriend comes out and they leave in his VW Beetle. My former boss gets picked up by her date a short while later, and she thinks nothing of it. The next day, she sees her girlfriend and asks how the date was. The girlfriend says that they started driving in her date's VW Beetle, and all of a sudden, she got a splitting headache. She thought it was really strange, but she felt nauseous. She apologized and asked him to take her home. He was a little upset, but he dropped her back off. They didn't go out again. Years pass, and my former boss is watching the news one night and sees a familiar man on the screen. It was Ted Bundy. In the late 70s, she had started a local community theater. At the time, the box office was a small building set a little ways away from the theater, both buildings in a residential but heavily wooded area. She was working the box office one evening and went to the main building to check on the progress of rehearsals. Things started to wrap up and she needed to lock up to leave. She realized that she'd left her keys in the box office, so she went back through the wooded area to get them. When she got into the box office, her keys were nowhere to be found. After looking around extensively and still not finding them, she had one of the other staff people lock up, and she called her husband to come get her. A few days later, Ted Bundy was captured just a few miles away, and one of the things he had with him were her keys. Hitching near Green River, Washington, a guy in a VW picks me up. A few blocks later, he suddenly pulls over and says, "It's your lucky day, little girl. Get the hell out of my car." A few weeks later, I see a pic of him on the cover of a newspaper. Ted Bundy. I was a lucky little girl. That was 40 years ago. Still makes my skin crawl. This isn't about me, but my friend's aunt. She heard a knock on the door and thought it was her boyfriend, so she wanted to scare him and got one of her kitchen knives and opened the door and yelled or something. Turns out it wasn't her boyfriend, but a man asking if she needed any plumbing work done. When he saw the knife, he left. She looked out the window and saw a yellow VW Bug. Ended up being Ted Bundy. Back in the late 1970s, my mom worked for the city of Pensacola, Florida. She usually worked the late shift. One night she had to print out some reports. At the time, the printers were those giant dot matrix printers that printed on the giant green and white striped paper and were located in a separate building. This building was located across the parking lot from City Hall, where my mom worked. Old City Hall is now a museum, and the parking lot has been turned into a small park. One night in particular, she stepped out of the main building to walk over to the other building to get the reports. She noticed 3 cars in the parking lot: hers, the security guards, and an orange VW Bug. She didn't recognize the Bug, and at first thought someone else was working late, or else they had left their car there, could have broken down. As she was heading towards the other building, a man steps out of the Bug and had his left arm wrapped up in a makeshift sling. He asks her if she could drive him to the hospital. She said she couldn't, but she'd call an ambulance for him. He was very persistent, and she agreed after the end of her shift. She got the reports, then walked back to the main building. The guy was just standing there, getting more anxious. My mom called the security guard, but the guy left before the guard could get there. A week later, Ted Bundy was arrested at Oscar Warner's Pancake House in Pensacola, Florida. Not my story, but my friend's aunt went on a date with Ted Bundy back in the day. She said he was really handsome and charming, and she was actually pretty disappointed he didn't call her afterwards. Once upon a time, I traveled to a land far, far away, Stark, Florida. The purpose of my journey was to visit a friend, Carol Boone, her son Jamie, age 16, and Carol's husband, serial killer Ted Bundy. I had known and worked with Carol for many years. Our friendship started in Olympia, Washington, while we worked at a state of Washington government agency. We became close platonic friends. Ted Bundy temporarily worked in our office. In fact, Ted and I worked closely together on the Energy Conservation Center, later to become the State Energy Office. I was the center's director, and Ted was assigned to me by the governor's office. While working for me, Ted proved to be an ineffective producer. He was overly organized and much too political. Bundy easily got bogged down in details and overanalyzed most everything, routinely not completing tasks. I recall Bundy telling me how he became involved in politics, as a volunteer, with Governor Dan Evans's re-election campaign in 1972. Ted posed as a college student, then followed Evans's opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, recording his speeches for analysis by Evans's team. For several months, Ted's desk was across the office from mine. Rarely did we socialize outside the office. When we did, we went for drinks at an office hangout, the Voodoo Room. I can still remember the thundering reaction that gripped our office when Ted, the most likely to succeed, was arrested as the most likely suspect in Utah.